Hi everyone, welcome to the first chapter of this course called The 10 Principles of Economics. This is a very foundational chapter because it really sets the basis for what's to come in the forthcoming chapters where we get into greater details on these principles. This chapter is going to be looking at what types of questions does economics address. We've talked about this briefly in our first meeting, but we definitely are going to be doing a deeper dive into what types of questions interest economists. Now, when we talk about the principles, we're going to be talking about three different categories. The first category being how people make decisions, the second category being how people interact, and the third being how the economy as a whole works. So under the first category, we will talk about four principles, three principles under the second category, and three other principles under the third category. So let's try to talk about economics first, and where does this term come from. It actually comes from two Greek words, oikos and nomos. Oikos meaning household, and nomos meaning laws, customs, or rules. So just to put this together, economics can be thought about as the rules that govern a household. When we're talking about households, you might be thinking about a single individual that could be a household, or 4 to 5 people in a household, or a much larger household. But in fact, there is much more common between households and economies. When we talk about, when we're discussing microeconomics, of course, we're talking about individual decisions and much smaller units like households or firms. But when we're talking about macroeconomics, we are talking about things, at a much larger scale. When we talk about economies, world economies, for example, just the United States or Mexico or Canada, we're talking about many households. And in the United States, we're talking about 330 million people. So it's easy for us as economists to understand households and how they behave and how they interact with one another, and scale those concepts to thinking about economies or societies or nations. Sorry, there shouldn't be an apostrophe here. Just society, nations, etc. And these terms are typically used interchangeably. When we talk about a society, a nation, an economy, we're talking all about the same thing. So we'll turn to some of the decisions. Since we're talking about rules that govern the household, we'll start with the household, and we'll talk about some of the decisions that households have to make. So think about yourselves and think about the decisions that you may have to make every day. If you can think about some of those decisions, you're already thinking like an economist. So some of the decisions that you might encounter are how much to work versus study, how much time to spend in cooking versus laundry, how much to save versus spend. So here if you think about it, we're thinking about different resources that we have to make decisions on. So when we're thinking about how much to work versus study, we're thinking about one scarce resource, which is time. And or even when we're thinking about doing cooking or laundry, or when we're thinking about driving to the grocery store, anything that involves time. Time is scarce, and you only have 24 hours in a day, so you have to use that time productively, and you also have to take time off for sleeping or leisure and things like that. So there are so many decisions that you have to make just with respect to time, which is a scarce resource. We're also thinking about resources in terms of money. For example, we decide how much to save versus how much to spend or invest, or how much to if you're trying to buy something for your loved one, for your grandma, for your grandpa, for your children, for your partner. You might want to think about, how much are you going to spend on buying them something. All of these decisions are again related to the scarce resource, which is money. So there are all these different decisions, but we don't just stop at households. We also come across firms or companies that also have to make decisions. For example, how much or what type of labor or workers to hire. Right, so type of labor or workers to hire. These could be skilled or unskilled. If you're thinking about hiring skilled workers as a firm, then we may have to pay them more, versus we may have to pay less or just minimum wage to an unskilled worker. But skilled workers may be more productive. They may come with more training or more education than unskilled work, relative to unskilled work. Okay, so this is not the only decision that firms have to make. Firms may also have to decide on how much to produce, but we'll get into all those different questions later on, how that's determined. But again, the idea here is that the firms or companies may have limited resources, limited funds, and so they have to make these tough decisions every day. And now coming to, when we thinking about when we're thinking about an economy or a society, we might we also are faced with very important decisions because resources are scarce, right? So we might want to think about how would we divide our tax revenues, for example, into how much would go towards national defense, how much would go towards education, how much would go towards the environment, how much would go towards consumer goods, etc. Okay, so these are very important decisions that society has to make, or an economy has to make, not just at a federal level, but also at state levels or local or regional levels. So these are all of the decisions that we think about. But at the heart of it, what we are really grappling with is how do we allocate these resources, because these resources are scarce. By scarcity, we really mean that society, it can't just be society, it could be a household, it could be a firm. Society has limited resources and we can't produce all goods and services that we wish to have. So at a household's level, you might think about, well, I want to go to Yosemite, well, not right now, but let's say in normal times you want to go to Yosemite, but it's exam time, and so you really have to allocate your time towards studying and not going for a hike. So you have to grapple with those limited resources and make decisions, but it's a lot more difficult at an economy-wide level when you're dealing with such important things like national defense, education, protecting the environment, and things like that. So finally, what is economics? Now that we know so much about so many decisions that are being made, we can say that economics is the study of how society manages its scarce resources. Right? So in most societies, resources are allocated not by one powerful dictator, but through the combined choices of millions of households and firms. So in the United States, you can think about this, where so many households and firms are making decisions every day, and economists, therefore, are interested in those principles that we were talking about on the first slide, on how people make decisions, how much they want to work, what they buy, how much they save or spend. And economists are also interested in studying how people interact with one another. And finally, economists are trying to analyze how, in an economy as a whole, how the economy as a whole works. Okay, so in the next few videos, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into the different principles of economics under these different categories.